there's still an enormous disconnect between what an executive expects to be able to do and what the software developer or what the machine learning person or the data scientist actually understands is doable.
You're listening to Gradient Descent, a show about machine learning in the real world, and I'm your host, Lucas Bewald.
James Champ is a partner at Bloomberg Beta, a fund that invests in machine learning and the future of work. He's invested in many successful companies, including my first company, Crowdflower, and my second company, Weights and Biases. So I've worked with him for a really long time, and he always has really smart things to say about technology trends. I'm super excited to talk to him today. So James, you've invested in AI for a long time. You were the first investor in Crowdflower, my first company, and you were the first investor in Weights and Biases. And I was curious to know your perspective on how your thinking around investing in AI has changed over the last 15 years. Like clearly the market has changed, but I was curious to understand how your thinking has changed.
You know, when I invested in Crowdflower, I didn't understand that I was actually investing in AI. I thought that there was a broader collective intelligence problem that you were solving, and I was really enamored with both crowdsourcing and flash teams at the point. And to be honest, I kind of still am. Like I still sort of, in some ways, that I think about AI or sort of machine learning more specifically, kind of as a misnomer. I kind of think that it's actually a collective intelligence thing that's going on, and so that's like on the sort of the broad theoretical side, and then the big change on the investment side, I think is, we went from a place where people actively didn't want to invest, or where there are a couple of folks that you and I both know who I actively encouraged not to use the word machine learning because I thought it hurt their chances to raise money, to a world in which now we live in where, sort of there's an incredible amount of investment. And what's interesting about like the incredible level of investment right now is that we're still sort of at the cusp of getting actual great business results, right? And so we're sort of like at that point right now where I think all the pieces are almost all there, but they're not quite. And everyone feels that you have that little bit of impatience where everyone kind of wants to get it, and the talent's not quite there, or the executives don't quite understand it. And so I think like that's and so that's like an uncomfortable but also really exciting point to be in.
Well, do you think there's some chance that we're set up for disappointment?
We are always set up for disappointment. You know that as well as I do. So
that's true.
So Lucas and I'm lucky enough to whatever. I guess every 2 weeks we have like our little morning chat, and I feel like sort of we have recurring themes, and one of them is this continued question of where are we in the market. And you have to admit that like the last probably few quarters, there's this sense that everything is coming together, right? But at the same time, as you feel like everything's coming together, you're still looking behind you to say, oh goodness, in what way are we overselling? In what way are people misunderstanding things? And at least to me, it feels like there's still base levels of understanding that are missing. And it still feels to me like there are sort of opportunities to define the market in sort of like the right way rather than the buzzy, silly way.
When do you think investors kind of flipped from feeling like machine learning was a science project to machine learning was like a good business to invest in? I mean, you've always done kind of early stage, seed stage investments. That's probably where the change happened the earliest. But when was that, and what was going on that caused that change in mindset?
I mean, some of it is that, well, okay, there's this little joke around Google and Facebook where, sort of what do startups really do? We commercialize things that Google figured out 5 years ago, right? And then we bring it to the rest of the world. And there's a little bit of that sense that that's like not ridiculous, right? That you saw sort of like the kind of changes that people were able to implement and build inside the big fangs, and then realize that this should be more broadly available. And so you had that on the one side, and on the other side you had like sort of these remarkable. Well, okay, so how do I think about this? I think about it in terms of on the academic side, you had a few things happen, right? On the one hand, you had great results, right? Just super impressive results. but also there's a way in which like academics sort of figured out how to play the game, in the sense that the machine learning world was sort of well defined enough now that people can compete on some basis that they understood. Um, I remember there was this guy who gave this great pitch around how to think about advances in machine learning, and he made the point that actually maybe it's really about the size of the data set. Do you remember who that guy was?
Do you think that's still true?
That was Lucas, by the way. That was Lucas. Just to be clear. Just to be clear. Um, do I think that what do I think what is still true?
Well, I do think the size of the data set is incredibly important. And I think, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I thought it was really the only important thing, and that advances in algorithms seemed pointless to me at the time. But I think in retrospect, maybe I didn't have such a quite extreme view, but at that time it wasn't clear that like you know deep learning worked much better than sort of traditional methods. There hadn't been a lot of improvements in algorithms for a really long time. And so almost all the advances felt like it was coming from bigger data sets. But now I look at, OpenAI and DeepMind, and it feels like a lot of the advances that are happening there is, on one hand, coming from bigger data sets, making more advanced modeling possible, but also advances in compute.
Okay, so I've got a nuance and sort of like the extreme claim you used to make, which is I actually think it's that with the availability of large data sets, but also with the availability of like the understanding that these large data sets were available, it meant that everyone understood how to play the game, right? That it meant that you have a whole wave of academics and companies and corporations and groups and teams saying, oh, we can play with these sets of data in interesting and novel ways. And so what that meant is that the thing that was the scarce commodity, or the the way that you basically laid that piece out, meant that people were able to work on it, and then that's where you get all these exciting advances, in part because everyone agreed on sort of how to think a little bit about the data.
Mm. I want to ask you too. I think one of the things that you did really well was maybe starting a real trend in content marketing among VCs when you and Siobhan put out the machine intelligence kind of infographic where you laid out all the companies. I was curious what caused you to start it, and then I feel like it became wildly successful, and you stopped doing it. And many other people have picked up where you left off, but without the same, in my opinion, quality that you had. So, can you tell us the story behind that?
Sure. I think, the fund start when the fund started, I think there was a sense that we were at the tail end, and incorrectly, there was a sense that we were at the tail end of a bunch of investment around big data, and that there were a lot of failed big data projects sitting around. And so then the question was, what are you going to do with all that investment in understanding and collecting data? And then one of the claims, or one of the guesses, was that you use that data for machine learning, right? And there are a bunch of AI applications. And sort of my old colleague Siobhan Zillis sort of had that, like, pushed that insight a lot. And I think in part because she felt it like just intuitively, but also she was surrounded by a set of folks who were like playing around different places with it. And then I think we were both sitting around thinking, wow, this is just so hard to understand. And we couldn't make heads or tails of it. And then basically what happened was, Siobhan, being just a really great synthesizer, but also someone who's quite dogged, sort of decided to go work with another friend of hers who figured out ways to cluster different types of businesses. And so she basically then took that, those, clustered a bunch of different types of businesses that included a number of keywords around AI, and then categorized it and then stuck it on a map. And, I think that was like a 2-month process to actually go through all of that and have all these horrible spreadsheets, because it was super. I mean, there are products now that do this, right? But it was like super manual in some ways. And what was exciting about it, the moment she put it together, so I give her all the credit for actually doing the real work. Then suddenly it felt like this world was legible for the first time. And then I think we kind of assumed that there should be people working on this full time rather than having this just be a part time job, and then they would do a better job of it. And I think that, and so for a few years, basically, Siobhan would take some time off right around the summer to like just do the state of what's going on. And I think it was really good, not just because, the categories were not always right, but at least it gave something for people to agree or disagree on it. And it made a bunch of connections for folks that I think, have been still valuable to this day. And so why do we stop? I don't know. Like there are too many companies, right? And part of it is there are too many companies. Part of it is like you think that like there should be. I mean, I do think there are a new class of journalists who now think that way, right? Who think that mix of computational plus willingness to do the work plus not sort of subject to like the day-to-day grind of reporting the next story, and they should be coming up with those conceptualizations. But I haven't totally seen. I do think it was a novel contribution at the time.
Mm. So one thing that I know you are very interested in because you talk to me about it all the time is kind of how organizations function as a collection of humans trying to work together towards a common goal. I feel like you think about that more than most, and you think about machine learning um, more than most. I was curious how you think, or maybe how you've seen organizations um, adapt to machine learning becoming more mainstream within them. And I'm curious if you have um, predictions on how organizations might continue to evolve as machine learning becomes a bigger and bigger part of them.
I mean, we're not yet at the point right now where machine learning is boring enough that it could be adopted easily. So we're still in the part of the market or part of the phase where there's plenty of exploration and plenty of definition and ecosystem definition to be had. But and you see some of that in like sort of slightly misguided arguments around augmentation versus automation. And I think you only have those sort of theoretical sort of questions when people don't have actual solutions they're dealing with day to day, right? But I think that there's definitely so that's the first part. And then I think the second part is that like management theorists have thought for a long time or talked about the idea of a learning organization, that organizations will actually get better over time because they learn things. And generally that's just been a metaphor, right? That's just been sort of because of course organizations are not people. They don't have minds, they don't learn anything, right? Sort of maybe those things get codified in processes or rules. And part of what's exciting about machine learning sort of in the next like the pre-AGI version of machine learning is that we could actually digitize a bunch of decisions that get made on a day-to-day basis, and we can actually literally learn from them, right? That like something as boring as do I go to this meeting or not go to this meeting, or something as important as do I invest in this project or not. All those things in the world we live in right now have almost no consequences. No one actually follows up on a consistent basis to make sure or understand whether things work or not. Or if they do, it's incredibly expensive and difficult, right? You just think about not you guys, but maybe some other theoretical organization, we'll have to spend all this time just digging down to figure out what product, like what random marketing campaign actually happened or didn't happen or how well it worked. And just the amount of automation people need to put in order to like systematize that. And what's exciting about sort of like, or at least to me, what's exciting about like sort of the data rich ML world we could be living in is that those decisions, we can now find out whether they actually work or not. And then we can actually maybe consistently start making better decisions, right? Now, there are also a bunch of, you're going to say something. What are you going to say?
Well, let's take your example of should I go to a meeting or not? How do I ever even know in retrospect if I should have gone to a meeting? Like how could an organization really learn whether or not it makes sense to go to a meeting?
Okay, so I think there's so one of the other angles that I'm very interested in is like that intersection around machine learning and the social sciences. And so if you'll talk to like management folks that or rather on the AI side, right? There's always this question of what's the objective function. And the interesting thing is that on the social sciences side, they've learned a lesson, right? Which is, I don't know, we'll have some objective function and it'll be good enough to like sort of manage, but it'll never be perfect. That actually you'll have to change over time because, the most interesting systems are all dynamic. They're dynamic because people are interesting, right? That, sort of once you decide that one metric is the right way to measure whether a meeting is good or not, people will start to learn that and they'll start to game it. They'll be like, you know what? Whenever Lucas smiles twice, then I'm going to go always make sure to make him, I'll tell some stupid joke and it'll detract from the actual purpose of the business, right? And so I think that the illusion is that you'll come up with some perfect metric And I think the actual goal is to continually come up with metrics that slightly will change over time, and you'll understand what works in a different works or doesn't work. But that'll be okay, right? That in you think about it in traditional organizational science, there's this great paper I think called on the folly of wanting A and rewarding B, right? Or measuring B. And I think that problem is going to be forever, but that's part of the fun of the job, right? That's part of the fun of creating organizations and social systems.
I totally agree with that. But I feel like I mean, maybe I don't want to harp on this case too much, but I'm curious because I always wondered myself if I should go to a particular meeting or not. But how
Mhm.
would you even make an imperfect measure of that? Like, what do you even imagine like looking at to,
So
um,
you can certainly imagine it you can imagine it as is the meeting useful to you? You can also imagine it in terms of is the meeting useful to increase the collective intelligence of the organization, right? And then sort of you can certainly do direct measures, which we can just literally ask you, how good was that meeting afterwards? Or we can literally ask the team, how good was that meeting afterwards? Or we can literally look at the number of things you write after that meeting, right? Or we can literally look at the number of times that you nodded or didn't nod. So, which is to say, all those signals are increasingly cheap to gather. And when they get cheap to gather, that's when we actually get interesting innovation. When it's incredibly expensive, when you need to hire like McKinsey to do some study and then hire a bunch of people to build some system, like some very expensive bespoke system, then it's not that useful, right? Because then your ability to move and play with the edges of your social system becomes too difficult. And then you're sort of your chance to actually design it on the fly and sort of continue to understand it, that's I think the interesting edge around social systems.
interesting. Where do you see machine learning making a meaningful difference in organizations today?
I mean, in all the normal places, right? That we're now finally getting good enough to cluster large scale bits of information in ways that are meaningful so that we can provide consistent responses. And so I think that piece of it, which is the big version of machine learning, finding the most critical decisions you need to make, the most digitized pieces, and then finding ways to sort of consistently improve and collect it. I think that's sort of where most of the energy and opportunity is right now. But that'll change, right? That'll change. I think that the exciting does that make sense? First of all, do you
Yeah,
know what I mean?
totally.
You know, okay. So let me take one slight digression as we're talking about this. Of course, one of the as you ask this question, the real answer is that executives could know how to apply machine learning if only they understood a little bit more than what they learned from reading or watching a movie, right? And there's still an enormous disconnect between what an executive expects to be able to do and what the software developer or what the machine learning person or the data scientist actually understands is doable. And so I do have to make the pitch, which I think I've done too many times to you, which is I do remain convinced that the sort of 3 to 4 hour class that you used to teach to executives on how to think about machine learning probably is the best. Like if we were to say what's the best way to improve the way people think about machine learning, you should make your boss's boss take a 3 hour course and just sit around and play with a very simple machine learning model, because in that process they will at least have some intuition about how incredibly powerful, unsexy, brittle, finicky, and incredibly scalable some of these models that you'll build will actually be.
Well, it's not the core of our business, but I am passionate about doing it. And really, it's not that we, shut down those classes. There wasn't actually much demand for it, or maybe we didn't pursue it aggressively enough. There's much more demand for the tools that we build. But I guess I'm curious, when you did the class and your
But actually,
colleagues did
have
the
you?
class,
Yeah, go ahead.
what's
Sorry.
that?
No, go
No,
ahead.
no, maybe I'm actually maybe I'm just softballing a pitch to you, but I'm curious, it seemed like you really liked that class and really felt like, your team got a lot out of it. But really, what was it that you feel like you took away from those couple hours of building models?
So what you did is you did it was to a wide non-technical or audience, well, a few technical-ish folks. And what you did is you gave a little overview and then you had them fire up an IDE, open up some things in Python, have access to some data of like, I forget, what are they, socks? What were the images?
Oh yeah, fashion MNIST for those in the audience. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And then you had them, and you gave them a very straightforward framework, but you had them like sort of played around with slightly different approaches. You gave them the opportunity to see the results, and you gave them the opportunity to sort of like play with different parameters. And then you introduced a few curveballs, right? And it was actually a very straightforward sort of exercise, but it was curated and it was like accessible to a wide range of folks. And what was interesting about it was that for the first time, rather than thinking about sort of like the grand vision of machine learning, you had like a wide range of folks thinking about it from a very concrete, like sort of the way that a developer would, right? Where you're like actually dealing with data and you're thinking, oh, what does this actually do? And you're thinking, oh my goodness, this totally broke. But by the way, I could also just apply this to like 50,000 images instantly, right? Which is an amazing feeling for someone. And is a different kind of feeling that you get from building software, right? And I think that intuition, I'm kind of convinced that you could teach this to Nancy Pelosi and she'd learn something and she'd make better policy decisions as a result of that. I'm kind of convinced that if sort of, we've done a slight variation of this with a couple other executives and it worked really well. And at least to me, it feels like that shift in mindset and also just like that little bit of finger feel meant that folks just had better intuition, right? And I think it made a huge difference. And then they also asked like better questions.
One thing that always surprises me about VCs, because they always come, there's so many come from a quantitative background, and I feel like there's so many investments being made, is sort of the the lack of rigor in the decision making process, as far as I can see. I'm curious at Bloomberg Beta, do you use any machine learning or any kind of, is there any kind of feedback loop where, something's successful and then you decide to invest more in that?
Only for top of funnel. Only for top of funnel. I mean, in our case, we're seed stage investors, right? And so our process for follow on is very different from, let's say, some of the bigger, like a bigger fund. But I will remind you though, like, sort of part of the fun of venture is that the game is constantly shifting, right? If it was exactly the same game, if the business models were exactly the same, then it'd be like kind of like everything else. It'd be no fun to be routinized, right? And part of the excitement of the job, but also part of the opportunity, and the only reason it kind of exists is that there there are chances for new business models to emerge where the old metrics no longer make sense. And and I think like those sorts of windows come around every so often. And to be honest, that's where there's that kind of uncertainty, where there's either a key technical uncertainty or key business model or market uncertainty. That's where like the amazing opportunities come from.
You have been doing venture for quite a while now and have seen a lot of, big wins and losses. Is there anything consistent, or in terms of like what you saw at the beginning of a successful company, or is it that the venture market sort of adapts to whatever that is, and the opportunity goes away? Like, I'm sure you reflect on this because it's kind of
Yeah.
like your main job. Like, is there any kind of common threads that you see in the successful businesses that you've backed?
I mean, I think inevitably there are arbitrages that exist or there are ways to tell signal from noise, but because the market is clever and you're dealing with founders who are really smart and care a lot about what they're doing, what you're going to end up seeing is like they'll end up imitating those signals of success, right? And so there's a little bit of this constantly shifting game where you're looking for a new signal to say that this thing means that these guys are high quality or this insight is like really important. And then they'll figure out, oh, you know what I really should do? I should make sure I game Hacker News. And then I'll get all my buddies to go on Hacker News and then we'll coordinate. And then that'll no longer be a signal, right? Or, what I really should do is I should make sure that all my friends are consistently starring my open source project on GitHub. I mean, just meaning that like once you figure it out, then because then this goes back to like I think why these sort of dynamic models are so much fun, right? Like that's the whole point of it. Because and then so then you march on and think, okay, what's another signal of success, right?
I'm curious now at this moment. if I showed up and I was pitching an ML company and my customers were kind of maybe the less tech forward enterprises. I feel like I probably shouldn't name names because some of them are Weights and Biases customers, but like, sort of like, if my customer base was like, Procter and Gamble and GE,
Hmm.
would that be more appealing to you than if my customer base looked like um, Airbnb and Facebook? Like, what? I mean, how would you compare those two? Is one obviously better?
I do think it entirely depends on the nature of the product and the nature of the solution. I think the way that I think about it is that there's sort of like a gradient of admiration, right? And in different types of markets, different people are higher up on the sort of like imagine that map, right? Higher up, sort of in terms of admiration. And, in some places, in some markets, some set of developer tools, then actually it does matter a lot whether or not the early adopters come from, sort of the tech forward or from Facebook or whatever, right? But in plenty of markets, and increasingly as machine learning gets mainstreamed, right, then the questions will all be around business benefit. And then the question is, who are the companies that other people admire or look up to or aspire to become in those specific markets? And I think
Mm,
that's part of the shifting nature of the game.
I see. And is the gradient of admiration always clear to you? Like,
I mean, you could, yeah. I mean, like, okay. So, the secret fun part of the game is when you figure out what that gradient looks like before everyone else does, and then you play with people who are sort of higher up there, right? And then you figure out, and you go, oh yeah, everyone's going to admire the data scientists at Netflix, whenever that was true, right? And then you play with them, and then you come up with much better insights, or when it was true about whatever organization. Um, and so, it's not that complicated to think about, right? You just ask people, who do you like or who do you look to, you know, and I think that constantly shifts.
so one of the things that we were talking about that I thought was intriguing was you mentioned that businesses that kind of focused on ML, even if they're not like selling into ML, but using ML for applications in different industries, you expect them to have a different business model potentially. And my thought is that the business model would match the market that they're selling into, but you felt differently. I'm curious to hear your thesis on that.
Okay, so I like so I'm a VC. I'm only right occasionally, and I believe most things provisionally, right? Sort of. But I'm pretty sure about this one. I'm pretty sure that we underestimate the effect of technical architectures on emerging business models. So, if you were to go back, I don't know, go back to like the Sabre, which IBM builds for, I guess, American Airlines, right? When they have a bunch of mainframes. In some ways, that business model, which is we'll charge a bunch of money to do custom development for you, that really comes partly out of the technical architecture of like the way that mainframes were like centralized in some other place, right? And the moment that PCs come around or like they start to emerge, there's a way in which we think about the maybe the best business model ever, which is to say, sort of the one that Bill Gates creates, which you charge money for the same copy of software over and over again, right? Like it's an incredible business model. Um, that partly arises because Bill Gates and Microsoft and a bunch of folks were stubborn and clever and pushed through an idea. But part of it was also because there was a shift in the technical architecture, right? That you ended up with a bunch of PCs. And so then a different business model, because there are different economic characteristics of how that technical architecture is both rolled out and how it's developed and how you get value, then some different business model might make sense. And then you see the same thing for the web, right? When you have a ubiquitous client in whatever 1995, I think everyone realizes that, oh, that means something new. And it takes 5 or 6 years before people come up with the right way to talk about it. But subscription software really only makes sense and only works in a world where you have a ubiquitous client that anyone can access from anywhere, which is sort of a shocking idea now, right? You compare it to like delivering CDs before, or before that, someone, I guess, getting a printout of some code that they were supposed to retype in. And so that in each one of those cases, it's it's enabled, and there's some new dominant business model that comes about because the technical architecture shifts. And of course, that only enables it. It's really the people who build the thing and market it and sell it and come up with the new dominant business model. Like, they still have to do that. But it just strikes me that the shift that we're going through right now around machine learning or data-centric applications, or this change in collective intelligence, however you want to talk about it, like that, the nature of building those applications is different enough, and the technical architecture is different enough that there should be some other business arrangement that ends up becoming the better one for both consumers and for some new dominant customer. You think about how on the machine learning model building side, like, you just think about just the amount of data you're trying to like just own and control and understand and manage, right? And you think about like how that changes what's a scarce resource. It just strikes me that there's something there. And so, to be honest, I'm constantly looking. Like, in my mind, what's my grand dream? My grand dream is to meet that person who's working inside one of the big companies, who's been frustrated because she's like understood how the grain of the wood of machine learning lends itself to some new business, and then her boss's boss is like, that's stupid, we need to maintain our margins or whatever, right? And so I'll admit, like, that's the grand dream, that I'll find that person and be able to invest and partner with them for a number of years.
In your imagination, are there ways that model could look? I mean, I suppose it's a little bit hard to imagine these new things, but subscriptions had been around for a while. Do you imagine like, a move to more of like a usage-based pricing, or maybe like
Yeah.
companies that are willing to pay for your data and combine the data? I'm trying to picture what this could be.
Right. So, let me describe some. I led a little conference chat the other day, a little session about this, and I kind of try to do this anywhere I go. I try to like lead a session on this because I'm kind of obsessed. And sort of certainly usage based is quite good and interesting, but I would just contend that in some ways usage based sometimes puts me as a vendor at odds with my client, because I just kind of want you to do more of the thing, right? And sometimes it's not really useful, because I don't want to name names, but like, we are certainly in a world right now where people are wasting a lot of money either on compute or storage without clear business value, and then they're going to someday actually figure it out, and then sort of cause a lot of trouble, right? That. So I think like that's the pro and con of usage based. There's certainly some notions around data co-ops, right, where the realization is these models get better when we share our data, and then we share our data, maybe we share upside together. Sort of. I think there are a bunch of folks who are trying variations of that. The dream, of course, always is to be in perfect alignment with your customer, and one way that happens is you have something like a value-added tax or a VIG, right, where you benefit when they benefit. But right now in the world that we live in, understanding that benefit is so hard, right, because it requires an enormous amount of infrastructure and management layers and A/B testing and blah, blah. Just think about all the problems, all the reasons why it's never worked. And maybe someone will figure that out, right? Maybe all the objections that we've had for the last X years around why this sort of like benefit-driven business model doesn't work. Maybe it'll work in some like sort of with some twist or turn of how we think about machine learning models.
You had me convinced many years ago that a competitor would come along to Salesforce that would aggregate the data and use it in smart ways, and Salesforce has this inherent disadvantage because they're so careful about like keeping everybody's data separate and not building models on top of it. Do you still believe that's coming, or do you think there was some wrong assumption that you're making, or has it happened quietly and I haven't noticed it?
No, it hasn't happened yet. I mean, like, look, Salesforce is like this enduring great business, right? That's going to last for decades and decades. That said, it still does strike me that there's an inherent tension. You think about all the trouble that they spent convincing me or convincing people like me to work with them because we believed that the data was safe in their cloud, right? And and then just the idea that I might share data with other clients is like crazy and terrible, and at least from that point of view. And so there's that inherent tension in sort of like the traditional or the now established SaaS view of the world. And I think it's very hard for the incumbents then to sort of like move off of that sort of way of thinking about the world. But harder yet is convincing their clients and their customers who've been trained to think that way, right? There's a funny, maybe not funny story around sort of Microsoft, where Microsoft got in a lot of trouble at some point for sending information back to their main servers about how PCs were doing, because they would crash or there'd be some bug report and they'd automatically send it back. It was a huge scandal because how could Microsoft be looking and stealing all my information? And the hilarious thing, not hilarious to Microsoft, but the hilarious thing about that is like, that's right as Google Docs is starting. And in the case of Google Docs, Google literally sees every single thing I type, right? I mean, it's like literally stored on their servers. And somehow, because it's a different configuration or there are different expectations around the business, I'm okay about it. And I think something similar will happen with some, sort of with sort of emerging sets of machine learning driven businesses.
Although it's interesting that you say that. You had a really interesting viral tweet at one point showing how much better Google's transcription was
Yeah.
than Apple's, which I thought was really interesting and actually made me think about the same point of, Apple is so kind of known for being careful with privacy, and Google is known for being kind of much more laissez-faire, I guess, with people's data. But it's not clear to me that Google has used that perspective to create a huge advantage, at least, in terms of market cap. Do you think over time, Google's point of view will really serve it, or has something changed?
Okay, so I think in that case, it's a little bit of a slightly different nuance thing, right? I mean, why was that Pixel 6 voice recorder so much better? It was better in part because they had an on-device model, right? That was one part. And another part of it is that they just collected data in much more thoughtful ways. And and um, and so what did that mean? That meant like sort of you had a very fast, very accurate sort of like local experience. It The fact that that's true is like also that that's definitely true, but it's also confounded with the fact that Google is a very large organization right now, and they've got lots of things that they worry about and lots of ways that they're unwilling to take risk. Sort of in my ideal world, someone who built the sort of technology that Google did around voice would have decided that, oh, you know what, actually, this should be part of some SDK or some API, and we should just make this available for everyone, and developers should be building a bunch of products, right? I mean, I think that's the other thing that I think we're on the cusp of, because we're just at this point where there's this massive investment in infrastructure and research and tooling around machine learning, and we're right at the point where maybe people will build products that are actually good, right? Like we're just at the point where the lessons learned around how human in the loop works, the lessons learned around experiences on user interface, all those things, they don't quite take it like or value added to like the end user. Like we're just at the point where there will be enough variation that some ideas will actually take hold, and so I'm sort of excited about that part too.
Are you starting to see that? Because I feel like maybe I'm too impatient, but I kind of can't believe how much better all aspects of NLP have gotten in the last few years. I feel like, transcription is now a solid,
It's stunning, right?
translation now, like, it works. Like, I mean, it basically works. You can communicate for sure with people that you don't speak the same language with by using a translation system. Hugging Face and OpenAI's GPT-3 have just like have incredible demos, and yet I don't feel like it's impacting my life that much, except for asking Alexa to play me music.
I mean, well, but you're exactly right. We're at that point right now where I'm hoping your listeners, sort of are building products, because now it's easy. It's easier to access it, right? There's this talk about democratization of machine learning. We talk about this often, I feel like, but I think it kind of misses the point, right? The point is, by making this more broadly available, it also means that the extraordinary person on the edge who might not have had access to try this before, the person with like the crazy idea that will make a huge difference once we actually see it, that they can start working as well. And I think that's part of the exciting thing that I think everyone misses as they talk about the way that this whole world is shifting. But you're exactly right that we should be deeply dissatisfied with, on the one hand, all the progress that's made with sort of voice and parts of NLP. We should be super impressed with it, and we should be deeply dissatisfied because the products and the product minds and the UI folks and the business minds have not yet figured out how to take advantage of those advances. in ways that actually make sense and go with the grain of the technology.
One thing that I would imagine being hard as an early stage investor investing in machine learning is that it's so easy to demo successful cases of machine learning. I feel like no other field is it quite as easy to make a compelling demo, and yet it feels like to make a working product, it's often going from like getting like bring the error rate down from like 1% to 0.1% or something like that. Do you have trouble
Okay, so
like
here's my secret art.
evaluating?
Okay, so I'll give you one of my current secrets.
Okay, tell me.
Um, so I just assume it doesn't get better. Like if the application requires the thing to go from 95 to 98 or 98 to 99, the mental exercise, okay, what if it doesn't get better? Will users still get value out of it? And if users still get value out of it because of the way they configured the problem, right? Then it's an interesting product, right? But if you're sitting there thinking, we just spend, it'll just be another month before we go from 98 to 99.5, then I'm like, well, I don't really know if I believe that. I mean, think about this. This goes back to like one of our earliest conversations around search quality. This is like many, many years ago. And like, what's the beauty of search? The beauty of search is that when it's wrong, I'm okay about it. And there are whole sets of products in which like you can take advantage of the fact that it's super fast, it's consistent, and when it's wrong, I'm okay about it. Right. And I feel like you do that over and over again, or you find the products that do that, then like those are interesting applications.
So for an investor, you're doing an extraordinary job of not bragging about your portfolio, but I mean, give me some glimpse of the future. What are the exciting stuff that you're seeing lately?
Um, Sort of, yeah, I mean, part of it is, okay, as we think about, well, there are two parts that I want to talk, like, I sort of want to highlight, sort of on the ML infrastructure piece, I still think that there are analogies or lessons to be learned from traditional software development, right? I think that you guys have done such a good job of understanding so many pieces out of that. And then but I still think that like, you think about like QA, like sort of figuring out how to consistently do QA, like sort of, I think that like there are lots of lessons to be learned from normal software development to be applied to computer vision and structured data and those sort of release processes. And so there's a company called Colina that sort of in the middle of figuring out parts of that. I think that like you look at companies like well, we talk about Sean every so often. Like, you think about you look at the demo, like the publicly available stuff about Primer, right? And you look at and just imagine sort of what they're actually doing under the hood. If you go to primer.ai and you look at sort of their ability to like synthetically generate, their ability to synthesize huge amounts of data and lots of articles and just make sense of the world, and imagine applying that in their case to like a bunch of national security use cases. um, I think they've done, I don't know, if you look up various things that are happening in the world right now and the word primer, you'll see these demos and it's sort of, they can't show you what they're actually doing, but like you get that sense of like, oh, this is changing the way that people are actually sort of doing things right now. So that's, sort of that's the sort of thing that I feel like on the application layer, but then also like sort of in the development part, we're just sitting on right now. There's going back to like your point around my secret arb, right? Which is I just sort of assume it's not necessarily going to get that much better. Um, there's this great guy, Michael Cohen, at this company called Spark AI, and their big insight is similar to that line, which is like they're like, look, we want autonomous vehicles and we want them to be perfect, but they're not going to be perfect for a long time. And so let's just make sure there's a human in the loop, right? And so you can think of them as like, in some ways, sort of like whenever the machine is uncertain about something right in front of them, they'll get a response in like, a pretty short SLA, then to make a decision. And thus you can actually roll out these applications, you can roll out these sort of in the real world applications with the realization that the model doesn't have to be perfect, right? That we can actually have backup systems. And I think that sort of perspective, assuming like the sort of non-utopian view of what's possible with machine learning is super exciting to me.
I'm curious what you think about, and I guess this is a broad question, but about ethical implications of machine learning. I mean, many people talk about machine learning and ethics, and I feel like there's constantly in the news, issues that come up with machine learning. What do you make of it? Like, do you feel like there's sort of special ethical considerations unique to machine learning, different than technology, or not? And I mean, how do you think about like what kind of world you want and what regulations make sense?
Hmm. So, I think I think it's a good thing that we live in a world where people are more sensitized, right? On the one hand, and so I'm very glad to see lots of people applying their minds towards it. On the one hand, on the other, okay, so and this might slightly get me in trouble. There's like a game that I play with friends of mine who are ethicists or thinking about sort of the effects of technology, and I sort of ask, sort of I think it's appropriate to ask these questions around sort of what are the implications of this or that. But if you were around in like 1950 whatever, and someone proposed the compiler to you for the first time, someone said, we got this really really great way of like making software easier to develop and available and mass and scale and et cetera, et cetera. Would you have allowed me to build a compiler? Just imagine all the harm that could come from a compiler. And imagine, like, to be honest, like all the harm that has actually come from compilers, right? Everything from hacking to stealing money from people, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a way in which, like, I think there's a reasonable argument that, like, we wouldn't, like, given some current frameworks, there's an argument for why we should not have had a compiler, which seems on the face of it, at least to me, crazy, right? Like absurd. And so um, to me, the questions instead should be this sensitivity and there should be these sets of questions, but in some ways, the questions should all be around how do we think about what do we do if we're wrong? And I think one of the beauties of machine learning is that embedded in machine learning, at the very core of machine learning, is this idea that these are not fixed heuristics or business rules, but actually these are sort of like these kind of guesses that we just have to assume that it'll be wrong sometimes, right? And so in that way, once you think from that framework, or once your executives understand that's how they think how models actually work, that they're wrong, they're never going to be perfect. Otherwise, you can have a big if-then statement, right? Sort of once you realize that they could be wrong, then you need to build the systems and the processes to deal with the fact that they could be wrong. And you also need to build a whole set of ethics and ways of thinking about, like, questions more like responsibility rather than possibilities, right? And I think that shift in the way you might think about sort of machine learning, I think it will be much more profitable in the sense of being useful for humanity. What do you think?
I guess it does feel like machine learning might not be as neutral as compilers in some cases. If you imagine it sort of taking inherent biases that we have in our society and then like encoding them in a very efficient system so that they can be sort of deployed at bigger scale and with possibly less oversight.
Right. And I think, okay, so that's only if you fall for the idea that we're trying to build an all knowing God brain that will solve things for us perfectly. But instead, and I think, to be honest, like oftentimes when you'll talk to executives, that's how they will think about machine learning, right? They'll think if only we can get this perfect, then like we can rely on it forever. But instead, if we thought about it as a bureaucracy that is right some of the time, but wrong too, right? And we thought about it as like a possibly fallible system, and we built in the support for that. Because remember, the nice thing about machine learning is that it's incredibly cheap. Like in the grand scheme of things, it's incredibly cheap to make these judgments on the one hand, and also it's centralized, right? And by being centralized and being cheap and conscientious, meaning it's like consistent, then you actually have like one place where you can go and you can always say, if we fix it here, we can fix it everywhere, right? So that's one part of it. And I think the other part that you highlighted, which is it captures inherent biases, I think that's the other part, which is like, in some ways, it's a problem with the way that we anthropomorphize machine learning. Like one way to think about it is this amazing, whatever mind genius thing. On the other hand, you could just think of it as like an incredibly conservative attempt to cluster collective intelligence, right? That if we understood that machine learning was derived from data and data is by nature historical and anything historical by nature happened in the past, right? Then I think that changes a little bit your expectations about what the model could do, right? On the one hand, and then it changes your expectations around what layers you need to put on top of it because you can't just rely on the model, right? You're going to have both sort of straightforward business rules to protect yourself, but also you also have human processes, to be honest, that will actually think it through. So I do have to, at this point, make the plug for one of my favorite papers, which is called Street Level Algorithms, which sort of talks a little bit about that, which talks a little bit about this. So you'll have to link to it. So I don't know if have you read it?
No, no.
Okay, I think I've tried to make you read it many times. It's totally worth reading. You should get Ali or Michael Bernstein to chat about it at some point. But I think like their core insight is that if you did think about machine learning models as bureaucracies or as like sort of processes that could be wrong some of the time, that you change your expectations, but also like the ways that you can take advantage of machine learning, which is say like you fix it in one place, you fix it for everyone, right? Those sorts of inherent advantages go with the grain of the technology rather than against it.
Have you ever gotten a pitch on a company and not invested because it made you uncomfortable, like from a like an ethical perspective?
Oh yeah, I mean plenty of times, right? And I think,
Really,
I mean,
plenty of times.
there are plenty of times when I will say, I mean, on the one hand, I'm utility maximizing, but then I have my own idiosyncratic definition of utility. And my definition of utility doesn't map directly to just dollars, but maps into ideas of who I am and what kind of person I want to be and what kind of world I want to be in. And I think that that's true about all VCs, right? That, VCs, like everyone pretends that they're like, or rather, a lot of people pretend that they're sort of pretty straightforward and like dollar maximizing, but that's not true. We all have taste and we all have things that we like or don't like, and good or bad reasons to say yes or no to things. And I think that reality is always sitting with us.
Is there a company that you feel like you've massively misjudged? Like, is there any like wildly successful business where you go back and like think about the pitch and feel like you like missed something or should update your belief system?
I mean, constantly, right? Sort of the whole set of low code, no code companies that I sort of dismissed. Like if I think, I don't know if you remember this conversation. Like there's at some point when we chatted where I basically said that, what I really believe in? I believe in domain specific languages. I think that DSLs are a much more powerful way to express business applications and the possibility for business applications than, than all these low code, no code things. And I was totally wrong. I was totally wrong. I entirely misjudged the value add of making something easy, and the way part of my head I was like, well, like a developer is valuable not just because they can write things in good syntax. They're also valuable because they have to think through complicated ideas, abstract them, and come up with like good code to actually build something, to get something to work, right? And what I misjudged was that there are a whole set of just like low level glue things that people need every day, right? That are super easy to do, that sort of fall right under the cusp of sort of really scary programming. And so that I totally misjudged.
Mhm. Well, one topic that we've actually never talked about, but I kind of wanted to use this podcast as an excuse to ask you is I'm curious what you think about AI and consciousness. Like, can you picture AI becoming conscious? Is that something that you think you could imagine happening in your children's lifetimes?
What does that mean?
I guess like could you imagine that there's an ML system that gets to the point where you would not want to hurt it, where you would sort of like care to about its well-being?
Okay, so there are a couple different angles that I go on with this. I think it's true right now. I feel bad when, like, I do lots of things to anthropomorphize. Sort of, I feel kind of bad when I drop my phone, right? I feel really guilty and I feel kind of bad about it.
Really? For your phone?
For my phone, yeah. Like I feel like, and I think there are lots of ways that I, as a human, sort of assume human-like characteristics to almost everything, right? From the weather to my camera to like the screen to like some computer program. I get irritated. Like, why do I get irritated with Chrome as if it's an actual person? Like it's just like a bundle of numbers, right? And so I actually think that we're there already. I actually don't think that I don't think that like my willingness to imbue moral worth or value to non-human things is something that's out there someday, but actually it's something that we do all the time right now. Um, and then, although I am Christian, which we talked about before, like I don't really take a magical point of view on consciousness. I think consciousness is like controlling what I pay attention to, and the continuing log to sort of walk through. Like imagine, sort of, and so like in that way, in that continuing log to sort of explain what I thought before, right? And um, so I probably don't. I mean, I both value it. I think it's really, really important. And it's like an incredibly important organizing principle, obviously, for me day to day. And I kind of think that lots of things are conscious already, right? That they already figure out ways to direct attention and organize and also tell stories about themselves.
Does your Christianity not inform your thoughts about consciousness at all?
Um, it totally does. I mean, it certainly, but I mean, I think there's a little bit of this angle where I I think that the things we learn about the world or science constantly shift. And so I'm actually quite open and willing to sort of adopt and adjust based on how we end up changing our view of the universe. Does that, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Is
totally,
that like a
totally.
coherent?
But I guess this thing that always makes it concrete for me that I also was telling you I had to ask you, and I don't know how you felt about it, but I always curious if people would go through that Star Trek transporter. Like if you saw a whole bunch of people go through a thing that disassembled their atoms and put them back together somewhere else safely, and you were convinced that it would work, would you subject yourself to that? Would that alarm you or not?
Okay, so I have contradictory impulses. Like I get carsick, like I get like sort of, I get woozy standing up on like walking over a bridge, right? So I'm sure there'd be that trepidation. But isn't there also this view, like, or like when you think about, sort of yourself right now versus yourself, I don't know, whatever, 10 years ago, like a bunch of the atoms have changed, have been replaced, right? And, in some ways, we are going through this slow motion transportation. I mean, in some ways, you're just speeding. I mean, in some ways, you're just speeding up that transformation, of the rearrangement of those bits. And so, like, I mean, I probably wouldn't be the first person to do it, but
You'd be
I
like
don't know
the
that.
100th?
Or meaning that I would not necessarily have some deep, deep ethical, mystical reason to be concerned about it, because I kind of think we're going through it already, right? I mean, like literally, your set of like atoms. Like, who are you? Are you your set of atoms, or are you set the pattern that your atoms are in, right? Like I mean, in some ways, like you're the pattern.
Interesting. I'm not Christian, but that transporter I think makes me more nervous than it makes you.
Well, I mean, but isn't it true though that you? I mean, like if you thought about like the current your current material composition right now, like the literal pieces of it have changed pretty substantially and will continue to change, right?
For sure.
And but there is, yeah. So look, I just gave you my most tech positive version of it, but sure, you're asking me tomorrow if I would do it. I think like, well, a little scary. Let's find out. But I do. But don't you also believe that you're your pattern rather than your actual? Like who you are is the organization of these things inside you, right? Rather than the actual substance of it.
That's true, but I feel like I am going to experience the world through somebody's eyes, and I think I am concerned that um, I might my future self might not be inhabiting the body of the person that comes out of that machine. But my wife strongly disagrees with my my point of view on that, so I can see both sides of it. I'm pretty sure that I just wouldn't do it no matter how many people went through it and told me that it was safe.
I mean, okay. Well, you say that now, but I will just remind you that like our ability to adapt to circumstances and to change expectations is pretty dramatic, right? There's uh there are plenty of things you do now that are super like would be super weird to like you from like 1999 or whatever. You're really young too, but you know what I mean. Like our expectations around what's normal or not normal shift consistently.
Like staring at a phone all day long.
Yeah, seriously, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, final two questions. One question is, what's an aspect of machine learning that you think is underrated or underappreciated or underinvested in?
I do think the all of the sort of HCI social system stuff really is underinvested in. And I think that there are lots and lots of opportunities. I think that it's it's interesting to me that the tools that annotators get right now are still so bad. I think it's interesting to me that the tools that data scientists use in some ways have not really changed since. Remember your friend Kayer, who wrote that paper like 2013? Look at his paper in 2013. It's like the tools in some ways have not changed enough, right? And so I think there's lots and lots of opportunities there. And then I think there are lots of opportunities in making I don't want to like making mainstream or more generalize from the lessons we learned from human in the loop. I think calling things human in the loop kind of was a mistake. There should be a better name for it. And if we had a better name for it, then everyone would think of all their jobs as human in the loop. Because I kind of believe that, right? I kind of believe that, like, sort of in the end, if we're successful, like every process will be slightly better understood and could be consistent and get consistently better, because our job as humans were to either figure out edge cases or create broad clustering so that we can be consistent.
So you care about the sort of interface of humans and machine learning, how they can work together?
I mean, I think that I think in at multiple levels, right? At the level of sort of the person sort of making the initial decision, at the level of the person sort of like learning from that, at the level of the people controlling that, at the level of the people benefiting from that. I think all those things, like the cutting edge, like we're still in a world where so much of that is siloed. Like the way to think about it is siloed. And I think the ways to unlock lots of business value, but also, to be honest, like just straightforward good things for humanity, is if people had at all levels of that game sort of like a bigger view of what it is that they're engaged in, which is like sort of a great game of collective intelligence.
Mm. All right. Well, practical question, which might actually have the same answer. It's never happened before as I asked these pairs of questions. But when you look at machine learning trying to get adopted and deployed and useful inside of enterprises, where do you think the bottleneck is? Like, where do these projects get stuck?
I think they're so often badly conceived and overpromised, right? And we joked about this in the middle of this. I am still kind of convinced that if we offered your exec ad class to like every senior executive in the world, that we would basically all make much, much better decisions, and we'd end up with like sort of much, much more successful implementations. So I think that part's definitely true. And I also think that like the other thing that's holding us back is we still don't have great methodologies for thinking about how to build these systems, right? That we are still in software development world. I think it was someone just gave me this history. Software, like random coding becomes engineering, like when NATO decides that it's an important thing in like 1968, and then we sort of codify all this waterfall stuff, right? And it goes from waterfall to extreme to agile over the course of the last like whatever 40 years. And what's interesting to me is that methodology, I think, is mostly wrong for building machine learning models. And and so we are still shoehorning these projects as if they're software development projects oftentimes, and thus wasting a bunch of time and money.
Awesome. Thanks, James.
Okay, take care.
If you're enjoying this interview series, the most helpful thing that you can do for us is leave us a review. It helps other people find the show. And really, we do these shows so that people will watch them. And what I really want is more people to find it. So if you leave us a review, I really appreciate it.
So, James, here's what I really want to know. How does your religion inform your thoughts on machine learning?
Okay, so this might be both borderline kooky and heretical. So we'll just caveat it first that way.
Fantastic.
Okay. So I think that there are a few different angles. I think the first is that sort of, at least in my theology, I think that, sort of part of godliness is the act of creation, right? And I think that there's a way in which, as an investor, I put faith in the act of creation in helping people make something new, right? So that's one part. Um, uh, and sort of the creation of however you want to talk about machine learning. I think there's this sense in which the models that we're building, in some ways, have sort of inherent worth and dignity, as sort of basically sub-creations of people, right? That we are creating something new, and whether you want to call it life or whatever you want to call that thing, right? That it is something like fundamentally new and different and interesting. And that piece of it then sort of informs the way I think about both its capabilities and why it's important. But at the same time, and so this is the part where I think other folks might have trouble with this, is that I do believe that we're fallen. I believe that I actually think that we want to be good, but we're actually bad. And I think that anything we create in some ways has tragic flaws in it, almost no matter what. And so in that way, I'm actually much more both forgiving about people, but also institutions, but also the models that we make, right? These things that we're making are both like have great beauty and potential, but they're also tragically flawed because we are.
Wow, I love it. Awesome. Oh man, that's definitely going on the podcast. That was great.
I mean, it's
funny,
kind of plausible, right? It's not crazy. I mean, it probably is crazy.
I mean,
but it's
I think I like agree with all of it. You know, yeah, I mean, yeah, totally.
Because I think we oftentimes all think we're good. I mean, I think we think we're good, but we actually know. I mean, it's not that I'm good. It's I want to be good, and I'm just always doing stupid things. And of course, the things I create are going to be imperfect, and that means that it also means there's this constant chance for improvement, which is the core of the understanding of gradients.